Welcome to class, everyone. Let's just jump right in today. We are taking on a really comprehensive historical analysis of one of the absolute most fascinating regions on Earth, and that is Kashmir. Now, as university students of history, you know by now that a region's story is rarely just, a dry list of dates. It's a massive, complex tapestry of geography, of myth, and of course, intense human ambition. So throughout this explainer, we're going to dissect the evolution of Kashmir's ruling dynasties, really tracing how power completely shifted over thousands and thousands of years. Okay, let's dive into this with a pretty wild question. How exactly does a massive lake become an empire? Seriously, think about that. Because long before there were any kings or queens or sprawling trade routes, the entire valley of Kashmir was literally underwater. Here's our quick syllabus for today's explainer. 1. Origins, myth meets geology. 2. Kalhana's historical blueprint. 3. Rise of the Karkota dynasty. 4. Queens, kings, and chaos. And finally, 5. The Shahmiri and Chak eras.
Module 1. Origins. Myth meets geology.
What is absolutely incredible about Kashmir is how its ancient mythology perfectly mirrors modern geological consensus. It's wild. According to the ancient Nilamata Purana, the valley was a giant lake called Satisar, and it was terrorized by a water demon. So to save the people, the sage Kashyapa basically struck a mountain at Baramulla, which drained the lake and destroyed the demon. Now, compare that exact story to modern Pleistocene geology. Scientists tell us today that tectonic shifts raised the Pir Panjal Mountains, forming a massive lake. And then, eventually, another major geological event caused the land near Baramulla to pave in, completely draining the water out. So the myth? It's essentially a collective, coded memory of a very real geological event. So when that prehistoric lake drained, it didn't just leave behind some dry land. It left behind a massive, invaluable geological inheritance. This leftover lakebed formed these elevated plateaus that are known locally as Karewa. And this soil is just incredibly rich with ancient deposits of sand, clay, and silt that had literally been sitting underwater for thousands of years. Now, you might be wondering, why does this matter for a history class? Well, because geography dictates the economy. The highly unique mineral composition of this ancient lakebed, that Karema soil we just talked about, is exactly what makes Kashmir the premier location in the entire world for cultivating top-tier, high-quality saffron. So the region's defining agricultural export is basically a direct byproduct of this prehistoric geological shift.
Module 2. Kalhana's historical blueprint.
So how do we actually know the detailed political history of the dynasties that eventually settled this land? For that, we turn to a brilliant 12th century scholar named Kalhana. He wrote the Raja Tarangini, which translates to the River of Kings. He argued, and I'll quote him here, that noble-minded poet is alone worthy of praise whose word, like that of a judge, keeps free from love or hatred in relating the facts of the past. Guys, that is an incredible demand for absolute judicial impartiality for the year 1148. He wasn't just penning royal propaganda to please a king, he was truly aiming for objective truth. And to achieve this level of impartiality, Kalhana utilized a surprisingly modern, purely evidence-based research methodology. He didn't just casually rely on myths. No, he synthesized 11 older historical texts, cross-referenced them with actual physical temple inscriptions, examined numismatic evidence, ancient coins, and carefully documented local traditions. He essentially gave us the definitive academic blueprint for studying the region's past. Using Kalhana's work right alongside modern archaeological evidence, we can clearly structure the timeline of the early empires. Starting way back in the 3rd century BCE, the valley saw massive urbanization and the spread of Buddhism under the Mauryan Empire, specifically under Ashoka. Moving forward to the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, this evolved into a real intellectual golden age during the Kushan Empire. They even hosted the massive 4th Buddhist Council. But this peace was completely shattered in the 6th century by the incredibly violent invasions of the Huns, led by a ruthless commander named Meherkula. This whole era of devastation, however, eventually paved the way for the rise of the indigenous medieval dynasties we're going to look at next. Module 3. Rise of the Karkota dynasty. Now, what's really interesting about this era is that as we shift into the political science side of things, we find that the mighty Karkota dynasty was not born from some bloody, dramatic battlefield. Actually, it started with a quiet, brilliant, strategic marriage. A man named Durlabar Devana was working a relatively humble day job as the officer of royal fodder. Basically, he managed the horses. Well, King Lalitaditya, who was severely lacking a male heir, saw this guy's capability and simply arranged for him to marry Princess Anagalaga. This arrangement allowed for a perfectly smooth, totally bloodless transfer of power, which officially established the Karkota dynasty. And because that foundation was so stable and bloodless at home, the Karkotas could focus all their energy outward. Under Emperor Lalitaditya Muktapida, the empire absolutely reached its zenith. He expanded the borders massively, conquering Kannauj out in the Indian plains, securing vital paths along the Silk Road, and then using all that immense wealth generated by trade to build stunning architectural marvels, the most famous, of course, being the magnificent Martan Sun Temple.
Module 4. Queens, Kings, and Chaos.
But, as we know, vast empires inevitably suffer from administrative fatigue, right? This leads to central fracturing and centuries of intense volatility, where powerful local landlords who were known in Kashmir as damaras really begin to assert their dominance. We can see a stark contrast in how subsequent rulers tried to manage this internal pressure. On one hand, you have Avantivarman of the Utpala dynasty. He wisely recognized that a hungry valley could never be stable, so he stopped all foreign wars, cleared the rivers, and focused entirely on agriculture. The results? Total stability, food surplus, and a literary renaissance. On the other extreme, you've got King Harsha of the later Lohara dynasty. Desperate for funds to fight off rebellions, he implemented crushing heavy taxation and literally state-sponsored the looting of his own temples. The result there was total chaos, an empty treasury, and his eventual violent downfall. Right in the middle of this wildly chaotic era emerges one of the absolute most complex figures in Kashmiri history, Queen Dida. She was operating in a highly volatile, completely male-dominated court where survival was rarely guaranteed. Actually, scratch that. She wasn't just surviving, she was dominating, and her methods were incredibly calculated and extreme. She served as regent for her son and her 3 grandsons, but as they grew older and started to threaten her power, she ruthlessly eliminated them. Just totally ruthless. To bypass the untrustworthy elite aristocracy, she shocked the entire court by appointing a simple herdsman as her prime minister. Yet for all her iron-fisted, ruthless grip on power, she ultimately orchestrated a completely peaceful transfer of power to her nephew's Lohara dynasty right before she died.
Module 5. The Shahmiri and Chaki eras.
So, by the 14th century, the old order was deeply, deeply weakened, setting the stage for some really profound dynastic and religious shifts. And this transition happened in a complete chaotic power vacuum. First, a Mongol commander named Dul Shaka invaded and just devastated the valley. The ruling Hindu king at the time simply fled. Gone. Into this massive void stepped Rinshan, a Ladakhi prince. Seeking some kind of social legitimacy to rule, he initially tried to convert to Hinduism, but was completely rejected by the priests due to his unclear caste. So he instead converted to Islam under the influence of a Sufi saint, officially becoming the very first Muslim ruler of Kashmir. After his death and the rather tragic end of the last Hindu queen, Kota Rani, a brilliant tactician from Swat named Shahmir swooped in, seized control, and officially founded the Shahmiri dynasty. And this brilliantly illustrates the vast, vast differences in governance that can exist even within the exact same dynasty, giving us 2 incredibly contrasting rulers. You have Sultan Sikandar, who implemented incredibly strict orthodox policies. He imposed the jizya tax, he banned music, he destroyed temples, which led to massive cultural disruption. But then his son Zainul Abidin, affectionately known as Bud Shah, immediately reversed pretty much all of these policies. He repealed the tax, he rebuilt the destroyed temples, and he brought in master craftsmen from Central Asia. This completely sparked a 50-year golden age of religious tolerance and birthed the legendary Kashmiri handicraft industries, like papier-mâché and pashmina, that are still world famous today. Well, eventually, as all empires do, the Shahmir dynasty also lost its grip. The resulting power vacuum was filled by the Chak dynasty. Now, they originally started as Dardic warriors from the northern Gilgit and Gurez regions, but they had slowly migrated into the valley over the centuries. They ended up bringing the Shia Islamic faith into a predominantly Sunni region, which obviously created some brand new political dynamics. But their rule was pretty brief. In 1586, the mighty Mughal Empire swept in, completely absorbing the valley and effectively ending Kashmir's very long era of independent rule. So as we wrap up today's class, I want to leave you guys with a pretty provocative thought to chew on. Ultimately, is the history of a region shaped more by the ambitions of its rulers, the strategic marriages, the ruthless court politics, the religious policy flips, Or is it really shaped more by the absolute inescapable geography of its land, the ancient tectonic lakebeds, those massive high mountains, and the isolating winters? I want you to keep questioning the past, keep analyzing the evidence, and I will see you all in the next explainer.